Hello everybody, today we're going to be doing a what could have been video where I talk about the Boston Bruins, 2010 Boston Bruins, and I alternate NHL history. So before we start, I wanted to say please make sure to subscribe to my channel if you are new to me or hockey, whatever the case may be. I'd love to have you here along the way. Now let's get into it. And a big thing I wanted to point out early on, I'm only changing the years that they made it to the Stanley Cup final and they lost. I could, go through every year and say, oh, if this would have happened, blah blah blah, but this is still going to probably be at least around a 10-minute video, and I didn't know how long that would be if I went another route, so we're going to basically go off of that where they win the years that they lose in the Stanley Cup final. So what actually happened in the 2010s for the Boston Bruins? The Bruins were a team that were consistently good. They made the playoffs 8 times in the decade, and they made it to the Stanley Cup final 3 times. That was a 2011 season, 2013 season, and 2019 season. Or at least those were the years that they ended up there on the back ends of those seasons, but they only won 1 time back in 2011. So how does it happen where the Bruins end up winning all 3 championships and becomes the team of the decade? So we clearly don't have to do anything for 2011 where they beat the Vancouver Canucks. They ended up winning in 7 games. Heartbreak city there for Vancouver fans, of course, the riots and all of that. But there's nothing to change there because the Bruins won. So we're going to ultimately shift our focus onto 2013. That Stanley Cup final, we saw an original 6 matchup where they played the Chicago Blackhawks, a team that was just on the up and up. They, of course, won in 2010 and were looking to be the team of the decade themselves, which they ended up being, I guess you could arguably say. And they were the best team in the regular season that year, the shortened season, where they went 36-7-5 in Chicago. And for the series, this was close with multiple OT game winners. And the moment we're going to alternate for this really isn't that crazy. We're just going to alternate Game 6 for Boston fans. You probably recall exactly what I'm talking about here, as this was a must-win game for the Bees. Chicago had a 3-2 series lead and were looking for their second title, which they ultimately got. But Boston seemed to have other things on their mind. Late in the third period of this do-or-die game for the Bruins, they held on to a critical 2-1 lead when Chicago pulled their goalie in favor of an extra attacker. That is when Brian Bickle silenced the Garden with a game-tying goal. No big deal, right? They're going to go on and win in overtime. Wrong. David Bolland scored less than 20 seconds later for Chicago to give the Hawks their second cup in 3 years. So we're just going to make it to where Bickle doesn't score and the Bruins win Game 6 2-1. This sets up a winner-takes-all scenario in Game 7 back in Chicago. And we're going to say somehow, someway, Boston wins a game with maybe a Nathan Horton game winner there for the fans to further cement his legacy for Boston fans with him. Now that that's done, let's shift our focus on to 2019. Boston was the 3rd best team during that season and wound up in the Stanley Cup final yet again to play the St. Louis Blues, a team that was really at the bottom of the barrel come January of that season, but they ended up going on to win the Stanley Cup. Of course, the Blues did in Game 7 thanks to a crazy finish where they ended up going and, they I think had a 2-0 lead in that first period for the Blues. What's crazy to think about here is really that the Blues got dominated in a lot of ways, I feel like, in the first period of that Game 7 game and had a lot of puck luck go their way. So instead of being down 2-0 in the first period for the Bruins, we're going to say that they actually go on to stop the Blues' magical run and have a better first period there and win that game, because that was really just something that I feel like killed everything for Boston in Game 7. First period where they outshot the Blues, I think 12-4, and still were down 2-0 going into the intermission. So how would winning those 2 extra championships impact the club? This would impact the club in a variety of ways. I don't know if I can fully encompass it all as I'm covering the club in the league in general, but there's a lot of things you look at and you think, wow, that really could have made the league different or the legacies different had these things gone their way. A big one would be the 2013 exodus likely doesn't happen, or it's not as dramatic for Boston. We saw this in a lot of ways as Horton and Jágr. Of course, Jágr was on this team for the 2013 run there, but they seem to have both issues with management, and Horton was under contract, I believe, or was trying to get a new deal. I couldn't remember what it was, but they were a little bit weary about his injury history, and then they ended up moving him on. And then Jágr ended up going elsewhere. I want to say Pittsburgh the year after. I cannot remember where he ended up. But it was a kind of traumatic thing for Boston fans to see a guy like Horton, who was a fan favorite in a lot of ways, that had to deal with a lot of injuries, end up, leaving. And then Yager, of course, I don't think it's as big of a deal, but to have a player of his legacy and his caliber leave, not as fun there. And that is not the other thing you got to worry about here, as you saw former second overall pick Tyler Seguin traded. Again, not a very fun time to be a Boston Bruins fan. You lose the Cup, you lose Horton, you lose Yager, you lose Seguin, and Seguin was still a very young guy and was coming off of a very quiet postseason. A lot of people feel like that and his attitude were a big part of why he didn't end up getting the team to a win, or being a bigger part of the playoffs, and kind of view that too is why he was moved on from. So they shipped him off to Dallas, where he would go on to have back-to-back 37-goal seasons for the Stars, and he has strung together a very good career in Texas, even making it to the Stanley Cup final in 2020. And yeah, looking at that, maybe things could have gone a little bit better had some things not ended the way they did for him in Dallas. He wasn't able to find a lot of playoff success, I guess you could say, in Dallas, but in general, you look at how much things could have changed for him and the Bruins. Instead, both sides are feeling a little bit discouraged about how that went down. You knew that Seguin was under contract at that point, and then you just see him go on to have success with another team. Maybe not to the level that he's hoping for, but again, very frustrating. And you wonder, especially if Seguin's there, do they end up winning another Stanley Cup during the 2010s? Other guys like Bergeron, the Rat, and Char would be able to have more impressive resumes. Not to say that they don't, and that they aren't guys that have tremendous impacts for their legacy in Boston, and that are guys that will probably get statues, but they would have multiple cups that they could brag about in Boston with the fans. Also, Tuukka Rask, this was something that I felt like going into this, I already knew, but afterwards I still felt it even more so. I feel like people in not only Boston, but in the NHL world would view Tuukka's career so much differently than what we saw, what it ended out as, because Tuukka was a guy that put together a very incredible career. Maybe, it wasn't as long as some other careers, and yeah, it really didn't end with that peak moment where he's able to hoist the cup, but you're looking at how we look at him now, and it's just dumb. I hate to say it, but people argue about his legacy. Fact of the matter is, he had a lot of great moments and was a very good goalie for Boston. And, people love Tim Thomas. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But Tuukka would be that guy. People used to chant his name in the stadium. And now especially, I feel like people just are already starting to forget about that. But anyway, moving on to another thing, Chicago's dynasty may never form because they would have to win 3+ championships to be able to say that they're a dynasty in a certain time frame. Now, if they don't win in 2013, maybe they win in 2014 instead of the Kings. I don't know, but we do know that if the Bruins are able to take away that championship from them, they guaranteed would only have 2 if the timeline continued on where they won in 2015 and maybe never become that dynasty. Who knows? But that would be weird. But most shocking of all, I think, would be the fact that Peter Chiarelli's legacy would be so different. You look at what he did in Boston, the fact that he was fired in 2015. If he wins in 2013, I guarantee he doesn't get fired in 2015. Of course, you wouldn't have Seguin having a great year in Dallas too, which probably would make that look even worse. But he wouldn't have the Seguin drama. You wouldn't have the, oh, you haven't won a cup since 2011. You'd have, oh, I just won a cup in 2013 for this team. If he goes on and wins another cup in Boston in 2019, you're looking at this and saying, wow, they really are having a guy that knows a lot about hockey. Instead, he ends up going to Edmonton as part of a Taylor Hall trade that looks really bad, and a Milan Lucic signing that looked bad as well. And you think, yikes, this is a guy that his legacy is greatly impacted by all that went down there in his time with Boston. And afterwards, if he's there for Boston and the things are different, that's good for him and the Bees, as they are the team of the decade. Ultimately, they aren't, because they only won 1 title. I'd argue Chicago, I guess, is if you had to pick one. And I guess one other thing out of all this is St. Louis would still not have a Stanley Cup to this day. But what are your thoughts on all this? What could have been for the 2010s Boston Bruins? What will be the what could have been team for the 2020s? Let me know down below. Also, please make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new. Everybody stay safe. Have a great night, and you will have hockey all right. Goodbye, Brigadiers and Brigadettes. This is your captain signing off. Have a great night.